June 1966. Robert Kennedy stands in a packed stadium in apartheid South Africa and tells 20,000 people that every small act of courage sends out ripples of hope. Beautiful, right? Except 12 years earlier, that same guy was working for Joe McCarthy, destroying people's lives with communist witch hunts. So today's question, can someone actually transform that radically, or was Bobby Kennedy history's greatest performance artist?
We're opening with, was Bobby Kennedy fake? Bold choice.
I'm not saying he was fake. I'm saying his story breaks every simple narrative we want to tell. Hero Bobby versus villain Bobby. Compassionate Bobby versus ruthless Bobby. It's the same person, Mark. That's what makes it fascinating and also deeply uncomfortable.
Uncomfortable how?
Because if Bobby Kennedy can go from McCarthyite enforcer to civil rights prophet, then maybe our categories of good and bad people are too simple. Maybe people are more complicated than Twitter wants them to be.
Twitter's not ready for that conversation.
Twitter's never ready for that conversation.
Okay, so lay out today's roadmap. Where are we going?
5 inflection points, 5 moments where Robert Kennedy's life trajectory fundamentally changed direction. 1, his childhood and family dysfunction. 2, working for McCarthy in the moment he quit. 3, his brother Jack's assassination in 1963. 4, his trip to South Africa in 66. 5, his 1968 presidential campaign and assassination.
So basically, his whole life.
His whole compressed, tragic, transformative life. 42 years from overlooked 7th kid to presidential candidate to corpse on a kitchen floor. And every piece matters for understanding who he became.
I feel like we should have a grief counsellor on standby for this episode.
Honestly, not the worst idea. All right, inflection point 1, the childhood. Bobby's born November 7th, 1925. 7th of 9 Kennedy kids. His dad, Joseph Kennedy Sr., made millions through bootlegging.
Allegedly
Bootlegging during Prohibition. Also stock manipulation, real estate, Hollywood. Joe Sr. was the kind of guy who'd foreclose on an orphanage if the numbers worked. And he ran his family the exact same way. Winners get love and resources. Losers get ignored.
And Bobby was?
Bobby was small, sickly, uncoordinated in a family, obsessed with touch football and competitive sailing. All the attention went to the older boys, Joe Jr., who's supposed to be president someday, and Jack, who is charming and witty. Bobby was just kind of there, the overlooked middle kid nobody quite knew what to do with.
That's brutal for a child.
There's this story, Bobby's maybe 9 or 10, trying to learn to sail at the family compound in Hyannis Port. He keeps screwing up, the boom hits him, he can't get the tack right, the sail goes slack, and his dad is standing on the dock watching, not helping, not encouraging, just standing there shaking his head in visible disappointment.
At his own child.
And what does Bobby do? Does he give up? No. He gets angry, and that anger becomes his whole personality for the next 20 years.
So Bobby's defining trait is rage?
Compensatory rage. He can't be the biggest or strongest or smoothest, so he becomes the most aggressive, the most driven, the most willing to destroy anyone who gets in his way. His college friends called him Pious Bobby because he was judgmental and self-righteous. His brother, Jack Staffers, called him Little Brother is Watching because he'd show up and criticize everything.
It sounds delightful.
He was not delightful. Early Bobby was kind of a nightmare. But here's where it gets psychologically interesting. In August 1944, Bobby's oldest brother, Joe Jr., who was supposed to be the family's golden boy, their future president dies when his plane explodes over the English Channel during a World War II bombing mission.
How old was Bobby?
18, and Joe's death completely destroys him. Bobby worshipped his older brother, and suddenly the person he'd spent his whole childhood trying to impress was gone. Bobby fell into this deep depression, couldn't function for months.
That's devastating.
It rewired his entire identity, because now Bobby wasn't the overlooked 7th kid anymore. He was supposed to be the family protector. Jack was the new golden boy, the one expected to enter politics. And Bobby's job was to guard him, attack anyone who threatened the family, destroy anyone who got in their way.
So his brother's death gave him purpose.
It gave him purpose, but it was a toxic purpose. Bobby channeled all his grief into aggression. He became this human weapon for his family. He wasn't healing from Joe's death. He was weaponizing it.
And that brings us to McCarthy.
Inflection point 2.
The communist witch hunts.
So it's the early 1950s. The Cold War is in full paranoia mode. The Soviet Union has nuclear weapons. China falls to Mao's communists in 1949. The Korean War is happening. Americans genuinely believe communists are infiltrating every institution, waiting to destroy democracy from within.
Which was not entirely wrong, right? There were some Soviet spies.
There were some Soviet spies. The Rosenbergs were executed in 1953 for allegedly passing atomic secrets to the Soviets, and that was probably real. But McCarthy took legitimate security concerns and turned them into a circus. He'd wave papers around claiming he had lists of hundreds of communists in the State Department, though he never actually produced evidence.
And Bobby Kennedy signed up for this.
Bobby Kennedy enthusiastically signed up for this. In January 1953, he becomes assistant counsel to Senator Joe McCarthy's permanent subcommittee on investigations. Bobby's 27 years old, fresh out of law school, and his father got him the job.
Nepotism strikes again.
Kennedy family specialty. And Bobby dives in with that same aggressive energy he brings to everything. He interrogates witnesses, builds cases, goes after people with prosecutorial ruthlessness. There are transcripts of Bobby cross-examining witnesses where he just cuts them off, demands yes or no answers, treats accusations as facts.
So he's good at this?
He's terrifyingly good at this. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Bobby genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. He thought communism was an existential threat to America. He thought these investigations were protecting democracy. He didn't see himself as a villain. He saw himself as a patriot.
Which is how most villains see themselves.
Exactly. And this is important because it shows Bobby wasn't born wise. He was born with the same capacity for self-righteousness and cruelty that we all have. The difference is what happened next.
What happened next?
Bobby worked for McCarthy for 7 months. And over those 7 months, he watched McCarthy get more erratic, more extreme, more willing to destroy innocent people for publicity. McCarthy started going after the US Army, claiming generals were communist sympathizers. And Bobby realized this had crossed the line.
So he quit.
He quit. July 1953. There's this story. Nobody knows if it's exactly true, but it captures the moment where Bobby walks into McCarthy's office and they have this huge screaming fight. McCarthy says something like, "You're either with me or you're a communist sympathizer." And Bobby says, "Then I guess I'm a communist sympathizer," and walks out.
That must have taken guts.
It took guts, but it also required Bobby to admit something incredibly painful, that he'd been loyal to something evil, that his aggression and certainty had made him complicit in destroying innocent lives. And that realization that you can be absolutely certain and absolutely wrong, that's the beginning of Bobby's transformation. So Bobby leaves McCarthy and spends the rest of the 50s working on other Senate committees, mostly investigating organised crime and labour corruption. This is where his obsession with Jimmy Hoffa starts.
The Teamsters guy.
Yeah, Hoffa ran the Teamsters Union and he was deeply connected to organised crime. Bobby saw him as this corrupt thug exploiting workers while pretending to represent them. And Bobby went after Hoffa with everything he had. They hated each other, like genuinely despised each other.
Personal vendetta energy.
Absolute vendetta energy, which shows Bobby's still operating from that aggressive, angry place. He's fighting corruption, which is good, but his method is still pretty ruthless. He's not fighting for workers, he's fighting against a bad guy. There's a difference.
So when does he start actually fighting for people instead of against villains?
November 22nd, 1963. Inflection point 3. The big one.
Jack gets shot.
President John F. Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas. Bobby's at home in Virginia having lunch by his pool at Hickory Hill. The phone rings. It's J. Edgar Hoover.
Hoover personally called him.
Hoover personally called him, and Hoover's exact words were clinical and cold. "The president's been shot, not your brother, just the president." A few minutes later, Hoover calls back. "The president is dead."
That's how Bobby found out his brother was murdered? A phone call from J. Edgar Hoover, who hated him?
That's how he found out. And Bobby's immediate response was to say, "Which president?" because his brain literally couldn't process it. When Hoover confirmed it was Jack, Bobby hung up and walked into his yard and just stood there, frozen.
I cannot imagine that moment.
Nobody can. Bobby's wife, Ethel, said he looked like he'd been struck by lightning, just completely unable to move or speak. And then he had to call Jackie in Dallas and hear her hysterical grief. And he had to call his parents and tell them their son was dead.
This is where Bobby breaks.
This is where Bobby shatters completely. Because Bobby had spent the previous 3 years as Attorney General with one primary job: protect Jack, he investigated threats, monitored extremists, coordinated security. Bobby's entire identity was built around being Jack's protector, and he failed.
But he didn't actually fail. He couldn't have stopped Lee Harvey Oswald.
Rationally, no, but Bobby didn't think rationally about this. He blamed himself. He wondered if organised crime figures he'd prosecuted had ordered the hit. He wondered if Castro supporters were retaliating for CIA operations against Cuba. He wondered if he'd somehow brought this on his family.
Survivor's guilt at a massive scale.
Massive survivor's guilt, and Bobby dealt with it by reading. He became obsessed with Greek tragedy, especially Aeschylus. There's this quote from Agamemnon that Bobby carried in his wallet for the rest of his life. In our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart until, in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God.
That's beautiful and devastating.
That's Bobby's entire philosophy after Jack's death. That suffering, if you let it, teaches you something essential. That pain can crack you open and let wisdom in. And Bobby was about to learn that lesson in the hardest way possible.
Okay, so Bobby's in this grief spiral after Jack's assassination. What brings him out of it?
Slowly, gradually being forced to confront poverty. See, Bobby's still technically Attorney General, but Lyndon Johnson is president now, and they hate each other. Johnson thinks Bobby's a spoiled rich kid. Bobby thinks Johnson's crude and stole Jack's legacy. So Bobby decides to run for Senate from New York in 1964.
Wait, Bobby Kennedy wasn't from New York.
Bobby Kennedy was from Massachusetts, lived in Virginia, had zero connection to New York except he needed somewhere to run. Total carpetbagger, but he won because he was a Kennedy.
And winning meant representing New York.
Which meant representing one of the most diverse, complicated states in America. And Bobby, this guy who grew up with servants and private schools, suddenly has to understand poverty and racial injustice and urban decay. And at first, he's terrible at it.
How terrible?
There's this story from 1965. Bobby visits Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn, one of the poorest black neighborhoods in the country. He's walking around with his entourage and he asks this local activist what the biggest problem is. The activist says, rat bites.
Rat bites?
Children are getting bitten by rats at night. And Bobby just stops because he literally cannot comprehend that reality. Rats biting children isn't in his frame of reference. So he asks to see a tenement.
Oh, no.
They take him into this building, holes in the walls, garbage everywhere, families living in spaces that should be condemned. And Bobby's standing there looking at these rat holes and he starts crying in front of everyone, his aides, reporters, local activists.
That must have been humiliating for him.
I think it was liberating because what Bobby realised in that moment was that he'd spent his whole life fighting communism and organised crime, these abstract enemies, but he'd never fought for actual poor people. He'd never seen their lives up close.
So this is his awakening.
This is the beginning because Bobby starts visiting poor communities everywhere, Native American reservations in the Southwest, migrant worker camps in California, Appalachian coal towns, Mississippi Delta plantations. And everywhere he goes, he sees suffering he didn't know existed in America.
And he keeps crying at these places?
He cries a lot. There's this famous moment in Mississippi in April 1967. Bobby's part of this Senate subcommittee investigating poverty, and they visit the Delta. Bobby goes into this shack where several children are living, and there's this little boy whose stomach is swollen from malnutrition.
Kwashiorkor.
Yeah, protein deficiency disease. And Bobby kneels down next to this boy and just touches his stomach very gently. Like he can't believe what he's seeing. Then he stands up and walks outside and stares at nothing for several minutes.
What was he thinking?
The photographer who was there asked him that. Bobby said, "How's this happening? How's this America?" And then he went back to Washington and testified before the Senate about what he'd seen. And he broke down during his testimony. Just openly wept while describing these children.
Senators must have been horrified.
They didn't know how to respond. You're not supposed to cry in Senate hearings. But Bobby didn't care anymore about what he was supposed to do. He'd learnt that some things should make you cry, that if you're not crying over starving children, something's broken in you.
Okay, so Bobby's having this awakening about poverty in America, but he's still just one senator. He can't really change the system.
Not yet. But in 1966, he gets an invitation that completes his transformation. Inflection point 4, South Africa.
Under apartheid.
Under full brutal apartheid. Bobby gets invited by the National Union of South African Students to speak at universities. The white supremacist government is furious because they know Bobby's going to criticise apartheid. but they can't deny him a visa without causing an international incident.
So they let him in and hope he'll be polite.
They let him in, and Bobby is anything but polite. He spends June of 1966 traveling all over South Africa. He meets with black South Africans in townships. He visits Soweto. He sees apartheid's brutality up close. And everywhere he goes, thousands of people line the streets to see him.
Why did black South Africans care about Bobby Kennedy?
Because he represented hope. He was JFK's brother, and JFK had supported African independence movements. Plus, Bobby was getting a reputation as someone who actually cared about civil rights. So to black South Africans under apartheid, Bobby Kennedy was this symbol that the world was watching and cared about their suffering.
So what did Bobby do?
He gave one of the greatest speeches of the 20th century, June 6th, 1966, University of Cape Town. 18,000 people packed into a stadium, students, activists, black South Africans who snuck in despite the government trying to keep them out.
What did he say?
He talks about courage and justice and moral conviction. But the part everyone remembers, the part that defines Bobby's entire philosophy, is this. Each time a man stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance.
The ripples of hope speech.
The ripples of hope speech. And what makes it powerful isn't just the words, it's that Bobby actually believed them. He wasn't giving political platitudes. He was sharing a genuine belief that individual actions matter, that courage spreads, that change is possible even when it seems impossible.
So this is where Bobby finds his voice.
This is where everything crystallizes for him. In South Africa, Bobby realizes that justice isn't just an American issue, it's a human issue. That apartheid and Jim Crow segregation are the same evil under different names. That suffering anywhere diminishes humanity everywhere.
That's pretty profound for a guy who used to work for Joe McCarthy.
That's the whole point. Bobby's story isn't about being born good, it's about becoming good through suffering and growth. And when he comes back from South Africa, he's a different person. He's found his purpose.
Which is?
To fight for people who can't fight for themselves. Bobby starts visiting Cesar Chavez and the farm workers striking in California. He goes to Appalachian coal towns and meets with miners whose lungs are destroyed. He visits more Native American reservations, more migrant camps, more poor black communities in the South.
And the government response?
Mostly ignoring it. Lyndon Johnson has the war on poverty, but it's underfunded and ineffective. The Vietnam War is sucking up all the resources. And Bobby's getting increasingly frustrated because he sees the problem so clearly. America is spending billions on war while children are starving at home.
So does Bobby speak out against Vietnam?
Carefully at first. He knows criticizing the war means criticizing Johnson, and he doesn't want to look like he's just settling personal scores. But by 1967, Bobby's giving major speeches arguing that the war is unwinnable and immoral, that we're destroying Vietnam to save it, that the domino theory is nonsense.
And people listen?
Young people listen. College students and activists see Bobby as someone who gets it, but establishment Democrats think Bobby's being disloyal. So Bobby's building this coalition of outsiders, black voters, Hispanic voters, poor whites, young activists, while alienating party insiders.
Which brings us to 1968.
Inflection point 5.
The campaign and the assassination.
This part is
This part
devastating.
is
So Eugene McCarthy, this anti-war senator from Minnesota, announces in November 67 that he's challenging Johnson in the Democratic primaries. Bobby doesn't join him because he thinks it's too risky. But then McCarthy does surprisingly well in New Hampshire in March 68, and suddenly Johnson looks vulnerable.
So Bobby jumps in.
Bobby announces on March 16th, 1968, and immediately people accuse him of opportunism, of waiting until McCarthy made it safe, then swooping in to steal the anti-war vote.
Was that fair?
Kind of, yeah. Bobby's timing was terrible from a PR perspective, but from his perspective, McCarthy wasn't going to win the nomination, and Bobby thought he actually could. So he got in the race with this message: end the war, fight poverty, address racial injustice.
And he started winning.
He won Indiana on May 7th, won Nebraska on May 14th, then lost Oregon on May 28th, which shocked everyone because no Kennedy had ever lost an election before.
What happened in Oregon?
Oregon was too comfortable. white, middle class, not suffering enough to connect with Bobby's message, so they voted for McCarthy, which meant Bobby absolutely had to win California on June 4th.
And he did.
He did. Big victory over McCarthy. Bobby gives his victory speech at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles around midnight. He's exhausted but happy. He thanks his supporters, black leaders, Hispanic activists, union members. He talks about bringing people together. He quotes the Greek philosophers and poets he loves. And then he says, now on to Chicago, meaning the Democratic Convention.
And then he leaves the stage.
And then he leaves the stage through the hotel kitchen. His campaign had set up an exit route to avoid the crowd. So Bobby's walking through this kitchen at 12:15 a.m., shaking hands with dishwashers and busboys because, of course, he is. That's who he'd become. And this young man steps forward.
Sirhan,
Sirhan, 24 years old, Palestinian immigrant, furious about Bobby's support for Israel. And Sirhan has a .22 caliber revolver, and he gets close to Bobby and fires 8 shots at point blank range.
How many hit Bobby?
3 bullets hit Bobby, 1 behind his right ear, lodging in his brain. That's the fatal wound. 2 more in his back. 5 other people are wounded by the remaining bullets. And Bobby falls to the floor, and people are screaming and trying to tackle Sirhan. And Bobby's lying there bleeding on the kitchen floor.
Does he say anything?
Accounts vary, but several people heard Bobby ask, is everybody okay? As he's lying there shot in the head. Even then, he's worried about other people.
That kills me.
It should, because that detail shows you who Bobby had become. Not the aggressive prosecutor, not the ruthless Kennedy enforcer, someone who genuinely cared about others more than himself.
What happened next?
They got Bobby to Good Samaritan Hospital. Surgeons operated for hours trying to remove the bullet fragments from his brain, but the damage was too severe. Bobby died at 1:44 a.m. on June 6th, 1968. 26 hours after being shot. He was 42 years old.
42 is so young.
It's criminally young. And here's what makes it even more tragic. Bobby was still evolving. He wasn't some finished product. He was actively becoming someone better. We never got to see where that transformation would have led.
What could he have been?
That's the question that haunts American history. What could Bobby Kennedy have been if he'd lived? Would he have won the Democratic nomination? Would he have beaten Richard Nixon in November? Would he have ended Vietnam sooner? Would poverty programs have been more aggressive?
Do you think he would have won?
I think probably yes. Bobby was building this incredible coalition, black voters, Hispanic voters, white working class voters, young activists. Nixon won in 68, partly because Democrats were so shattered after Bobby's death. If Bobby had lived, that coalition might have held, we need to talk about Bobby's funeral train, because it was its own kind of statement about who he'd become.
The famous photograph.
So many famous photographs. Bobby's body is flown from Los Angeles to New York. There's a funeral mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral. Teddy Kennedy gives the eulogy and quotes Bobby's favourite Aeschylus passage, the one about pain falling drop by drop upon the heart. And then they put Bobby's casket on a train from New York to Washington, D.C. to bury him at Arlington next to Jack.
And people line the tracks.
Thousands and thousands of people all along the route from New York through New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, standing in the June heat, holding signs, crying, singing hymns, poor people, black people, white working class people, everyone Bobby had been fighting for.
How long was the trip?
It was supposed to take 4 hours. It took 8 because the crowds were so massive, the train had to go slow. And there's these photographs from inside the train, Jackie Kennedy and Ethel Kennedy looking out the windows at all these people. And there's photographs from outside, people standing by the tracks, saluting, kids holding American flags, nuns praying, families just standing in silence.
They weren't there for a Kennedy. They were there for Bobby specifically.
They were there for Bobby specifically because Bobby had been there for them. He'd visited their communities. He'd listened to their problems. He'd cried over their suffering. He'd fought for them in ways no other politician had. And now he was gone, and they understood what had been lost.
The ripples of hope.
The ripples of hope. That's what those people understood. That Bobby's life, his transformation, his compassion, his willingness to fight had sent out ripples that touched their lives. And even though Bobby was gone, those ripples kept spreading.
That's actually beautiful.
It's beautiful and heartbreaking because we'll never know where those ripples could have led if Bobby had lived.
Okay, I want to push back on something. Was Bobby's transformation real or was it just good politics? Like, Did he genuinely change, or did he just figure out that caring about poor people was good for his image?
That's the skeptic's question, and it's fair. But I think the transformation was real. Here's why. Bobby didn't need to visit migrant worker camps. He didn't need to cry in Mississippi. He didn't need to go to South Africa and give speeches attacking apartheid. None of that helped him with establishment Democrats. It actually hurt him.
So why did he do it?
Because he changed. Because Jack's death had broken something in him that needed to be broken, this sense that he knew everything, that aggression and certainty were enough. And seeing poverty up close had cracked through his privileged ignorance. He couldn't unsee those children with swollen bellies. He couldn't unhear the stories of people sleeping in cars and working 3 jobs and still going hungry.
So suffering taught him empathy.
Suffering taught him empathy, just like Ashkela said it would. Pain fell drop by drop upon his heart until, against his will, wisdom came. That's not a political strategy. That's a human transformation.
All right, so let's talk about what this means for us in 2025. Because we're in this moment where everyone's cancelled forever for their worst moments.
Right, and Bobby's story complicates that narrative because Bobby did genuinely terrible things. He worked for Joe McCarthy. He authorised FBI wiretaps on Martin Luther King. He was aggressive and sometimes cruel, but he also changed dramatically. And the question is, do we allow for that kind of transformation anymore?
Social media doesn't allow for it.
Social media is the opposite of Bobby's arc. Everything you've ever said or done is permanent, searchable, unforgiving. There's no room for growth because your mistakes are frozen in time forever.
Which is terrifying.
It's very terrifying because if Bobby Kennedy were running for president today, someone would dig up his McCarthy stuff on day one and he'd be toast. No chance to explain his evolution. No room for nuance, just immediate condemnation for his worst self.
So what's the solution?
I don't know if there is one, but maybe we start by recognizing that people are complex, that change is possible, that someone's worst moment doesn't have to define them forever.
But here's my problem with that. Bobby had the privilege to transform. He had money, connections, opportunities. Most people don't get that.
That's absolutely fair. Bobby could afford to make mistakes and still have a career. He could work for McCarthy, quit, and still get another Senate job because he was a Kennedy. Most people don't have that safety net. One mistake can end them.
So is Bobby's story actually inspiring, or is it just another example of privilege?
I think it's both. Yes, Bobby had privilege, but he also made the choice to use that privilege differently. He could have stayed aggressive prosecutor Bobby his whole life. He had enough power to coast on that reputation, but he chose to change. He chose to be uncomfortable. He chose to question himself.
And that choice to question yourself, to admit you were wrong, that's available to everyone.
In theory, yes. But you're right that it's harder without a safety net. If you're poor or marginalised, admitting you were wrong can cost you everything. Bobby could afford to be wrong.
So maybe the lesson isn't be like Bobby Kennedy. Maybe the lesson is create a world where everyone has the same chance to learn and grow that Bobby had.
I actually love that reframing.
But I also think there's something else here. Bobby's transformation required him to see suffering up close. He had to go to Mississippi and kneel next to that kid with kwashiorkor. He had to go to South Africa and see apartheid's brutality. He couldn't transform from a distance.
That's crucial. Bobby didn't change because he read about poverty. He changed because he saw it, touched it, cried over it. The transformation required proximity.
Which is a challenge for all of us. How do we get that proximity? How do we see suffering that's outside our bubble?
I don't know, but I think it starts with being willing to be uncomfortable, with seeking out stories and experiences that challenge our assumptions, with letting pain crack us open instead of building walls against it.
That's asking a lot.
It is asking a lot, but that's what Bobby did. And if a privileged, aggressive Kennedy kid can transform into someone who cries over starving children and quotes Aeschylus about suffering bringing wisdom, then maybe the rest of us can too.
Okay, but let's talk about something that's been bothering me. Bobby died before he could finish his transformation. We don't know what Bobby Kennedy at 60 or 70 would have looked like.
That's the tragedy. Bobby was still evolving when he died. We only got to see him becoming, never being. And that's painful because we'll never know his full potential.
But is that also the point? That transformation is never complete.
Maybe Bobby's story isn't about reaching some perfect endpoint. Maybe it's about the journey itself. about the willingness to keep growing, keep changing, keep questioning yourself until the moment you die.
Which Bobby literally did. He was shot while shaking hands with hotel workers.
He was shot while being the person he'd become, someone who saw dishwashers and busboys as human beings worth his time. That's who he was in his final conscious moments.
That's powerful.
It's incredibly powerful, and it shows that transformation isn't about achieving perfection. It's about direction. Bobby was moving toward compassion, toward justice, toward wisdom, and he kept moving that direction until he couldn't anymore.
I want to go back to something specific. When Martin Luther King was assassinated in April 68, Bobby had to tell a crowd in Indianapolis that King was dead. That moment feels crucial.
It was maybe Bobby's finest moment. So it's April 4th, 1968. Bobby's campaigning in Indianapolis, scheduled to speak in this predominantly black neighborhood, and someone tells him King's been shot in Memphis. Then they confirm King's dead.
And the police tell Bobby not to go to the speech.
The police literally tell him it's too dangerous, that there might be riots, that he should cancel, but Bobby goes anyway. He stands on the back of a flatbed truck in the rain and tells this crowd of mostly black supporters that King has been killed.
What did he say?
People start screaming and crying, and Bobby says, and this is crucial, for those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and distrust at the injustice of such an act against all white people, I can only say that I feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man.
He referenced Jack's assassination.
He referenced Jack's assassination, which he almost never did publicly. But in that moment, Bobby understood that he could connect with this crowd's grief because he knew that grief himself. He wasn't above them, lecturing them about peace. He was with them, sharing their pain.
And then
he quoted Aeschylus. Of course he did. In our sleep, pain, which cannot forget, falls drop by drop upon the heart until, in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. And he asked people to pray for America and for compassion toward one another.
And what happened?
Indianapolis stayed calm that night. Over 100 other cities experienced riots and violence after King's death, but Indianapolis didn't. And historians credit Bobby's speech for that.
Because he spoke with earned authority about grief and transformation.
Because he wasn't a politician giving a canned response. He was a human being who'd been broken by loss and learned something from it. And people felt that authenticity. And here's what's tragic about that moment. Bobby gave that speech on April 4th. He was shot 63 days later. So he had 2 months between King's assassination and his own 2 months to keep building that coalition, keep spreading those ripples of hope. And then it was over.
Do you think Bobby knew he might be killed?
I think he knew it was possible. There are accounts of Bobby saying things like, if they want to get me, they'll get me during the campaign. He'd increased security after King's death, but he also refused to be too cautious. He wanted to be accessible to people.
So he chose connection over safety.
He chose connection over safety, which is very Bobby. The guy who used to be this aggressive prosecutor surrounded by walls had become someone who believed in proximity and vulnerability.
And it got him killed.
It got him killed. But would we want him to have lived differently, to have hidden behind security, avoided crowds, never shaken hands with hotel workers?
No, because that wouldn't have been Bobby anymore.
Exactly. The transformation required vulnerability. You can't genuinely connect with people while hiding behind walls.
All right, so final question. If Bobby Kennedy had lived and become president, what would America look like now?
Oh, man. The ultimate counterfactual. Would we have ended Vietnam sooner? Would we have had more aggressive anti-poverty programs? Would civil rights have progressed faster? Would we have avoided some of the polarization we have now?
What do you honestly think?
I think some things would be better. Bobby would have prioritized ending the war and addressing poverty in ways Nixon didn't. But I also think Bobby couldn't have fixed everything. The forces driving inequality and polarization, those were bigger than any one president.
So he wasn't the magic solution.
He wasn't a magic solution. But he was a symbol of what transformation looks like. And symbols matter. Having a president who genuinely evolved, who'd learned from his mistakes, who cared deeply about the poorest Americans, that would have sent a message about what's possible.
The ripples again.
Always the ripples. That's Bobby's legacy. Not that he achieved everything, but that he showed people what moral growth looks like, what it means to question yourself, to change your mind, to care about people different from you, to let suffering teach you wisdom instead of hardening you.
And we desperately need that now.
God, yes, we live in this moment where Everyone's absolutely certain about everything, where admitting you were wrong is seen as weakness, where nuance is dead and empathy is suspicious. Bobby's story challenges all of that.
By showing that strength comes from vulnerability.
By showing that wisdom comes from pain, that the people who transform the most are often the ones who've suffered the most, that you can be wrong for decades and still become someone remarkable if you're willing to do the hard work of growth.
Okay, I need to say this. We've been talking for almost an hour about a guy who died over 50 years ago, and somehow it feels urgently relevant.
That's because the questions Bobby wrestled with about justice, about empathy, about creating a more equal society, we're still wrestling with those questions. We haven't answered them. In some ways, we've gone backwards.
Which would devastate Bobby.
It would absolutely devastate him. But I also think he'd keep fighting, because that's what Bobby did. He saw suffering and he fought against it. He saw injustice and he called it out. He made mistakes and he owned them. And even when the fight seemed hopeless, he kept believing in those ripples of hope.
So we should keep fighting too.
We should keep fighting too. Not because we're guaranteed to win, but because fighting is how we become better people. That's what Bobby learned, that the struggle itself is where transformation happens.
That's heavy.
It's a heavy topic, but it's also weirdly inspiring, right? Bobby Kennedy was this flawed, complicated person who became something extraordinary through suffering and growth. He wasn't born wise or compassionate, or just, he became those things through pain and proximity to others' pain.
And if he could do it, maybe we can too.
Maybe we can too. Maybe America can too. That's the hope. Anyway, the ripples of hope that Bobby talked about in South Africa, those are still spreading. Every time someone stands up for justice, every time someone fights against oppression, every time someone admits they were wrong and chooses to grow, those are Bobby's ripples.
That's actually beautiful.
It's beautiful and tragic and hopeful all at once, which is basically Bobby's entire story. All right, so to wrap this up, Robert F. Kennedy, born November 7th, 1925, died June 6th, 1968. 42 years of life packed with multiple transformations, from overlooked kid to aggressive prosecutor to ruthless enforcer to compassionate advocate to presidential candidate to corpse on a kitchen floor.
When you say it like that, it sounds impossible.
It was impossible. That's what makes it powerful. Bobby lived multiple lives in 4 decades, and each inflection point, childhood trauma, McCarthy, Jack's death, South Africa, the campaign pushed him closer to becoming fully human, fully empathetic, fully himself.
And we lost him right when he'd figured it out.
We lost him right when he'd figured it out, but we didn't lose what he learnt. His speeches still exist. His ideas still resonate. His belief that change is possible through individual courage, that's still here. That's his legacy.
The ripples of hope.
The ripples of hope. And maybe that's enough. Maybe Bobby's 42 years of transformation are enough to inspire the rest of us to believe that we can change too, that we can question our certainties, that we can let pain teach us wisdom, that we can become better than we were.
I hope so.
Me too, Mark. Me too.
All right. I'm officially emotional now.
Same, but in a good way, because Bobby's story, despite the tragedy, despite the violence, despite everything that went wrong, is ultimately about hope, about the possibility of transformation, about those tiny ripples that build into waves.
And about how we honour the dead by continuing their work.
And about how we honour the dead by continuing their work. Bobby fought for justice until his last conscious moment. The least we can do is keep fighting too.
So, what would Bobby Kennedy want from us in 2025?
I think he'd want us to see people, really see them, the way he learned to see that kid in Mississippi or those workers in California or those students in South Africa, to let other people's suffering crack through our comfortable certainties and teach us something.
And to believe that change is possible.
And to believe that change is possible, even when it seems impossible, even when it feels hopeless. Because every small act of courage, every stand for justice, every willingness to grow and change, those are ripples. And ripples build, and walls fall.
I need a drink after this episode.
I need several drinks after this episode.
But it was worth it.
It was absolutely worth it, because Bobby Kennedy's story matters. It mattered in 1968, and it matters now.